I don't blame anybody for not realizing that it happened, but there are unfortunately serious questions to be asked to the BBC. What did they know when? Why did they act in the way they did? And why did they, so on the one hand, there's the responsibility to the individual, there's the responsibility to the audience, it's license fee payers' money after all. There's responsibility to so many other things. Weighing all this up must have been extremely difficult.
Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy is due to speak, we're told, to the BBC Director General Tim Davie today to talk about the organisation's handling of the Huw Edwards case. The former BBC News anchor pleaded guilty yesterday to 3 counts of making indecent images of children. The BBC is facing a number of questions, not least the question over why it didn't sack Edwards when it learned of his arrest on suspicion of serious offences in November. It has since confirmed that the corporation was told at the time that the arrest involved child abuse image offences. Let's have a word with former BBC executive Roger Bolton, who hosts a podcast called Beeb Watch. Roger, hello, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Jane.
This is actually, first of all, very troubling and very sad for those of us who, whatever water has run under the bridge over the years, actually feel deep affection for the BBC. How are you at the moment in terms of your view of the organisation?
Oh, well, I suppose I'm shocked at the disgusting nature of the offences that Huw Edwards had been involved in. It's very sympathetic to his colleagues with no idea and could have no idea what was happening. And yet again, the BBC is in a vulnerable position because there are vultures out there, competitors who will love the trouble the BBC is in. And I think also there'll be a significant section of the audience who just does not understand the legal and other difficulties that the BBC has genuinely need to face. So what I'm hoping is that the Director General, after his meeting with the Culture Secretary, will come out and give a detailed reply on what the BBC knew, when it knew it, and why it did what it did. I mean, I understand a lot of the difficulties. I mean, if somebody's charged, if somebody's arrested, they might be innocent.
Yeah.
You can't assume their guilt. You can't say, oh, well, because you're arrested, we're going to fire you. The second thing is you have a duty, obviously, a responsibility to a member of your staff or whatever who has obviously got very serious mental issues, did have a breakdown, is in a clinic for part of the time, is incapable of answering your questions, and you'd be worried about what he would do, whether bluntly he might take his own life. So all of those issues are involved. I think the other thing that's worth pointing out, though, is that BBC News, all the editors that I've managed to talk to and others, nobody knew about the arrest. Nobody knew about the initial charging until this last week.
OK, and that's what I wanted to ask you about, because there's a difference between BBC News and the BBC, apparently. I wasn't sure that there was, but there clearly is a very clear distinction. In fact, because of the importance of this case, I actually watched the BBC 6 o'clock news last night on television and the 10 o'clock bulletin. And both hosts, I think it was Sophie Rayworth and then Clive Myrie, made it clear that as representatives of BBC News, they did not know of the arrest because it was, quote, the BBC who'd been told of the arrest and not BBC News, which is a separate entity. Is that what you understand?
Oh, that is the case. And it's very difficult for people to understand because people talk about the BBC as if it's just, a homogenous organisation, which, as you know, isn't true. And what happens when the BBC or one part of the BBC gets into trouble, particularly if it's senior management, BBC journalists like nothing more than sticking it to them, to be honest. There's a fair amount of rivalry. And I think you've got to admire the way Katie Riesel, for example, the media editor, and the journalists have, reported this story as important as it is. But on the other hand, remembering that what we're talking about here, basically, are children being abused in the most horrific way. But, it is a shock because you can't look into men's souls, can you? How would the family clearly didn't know from what we gather, colleagues wouldn't know. This is of a scale, this offence, which it's so difficult for us to understand, but is so hidden. So I don't blame anybody for not realising that it happened, but there are unfortunately serious questions to be asked to the BBC. What did they know when? Why did they act in the way they did? And why did they, so on the one hand, there's the responsibility to the individual, there's the responsibility of the audience, it's license fee payers' money after all. There's There's responsibility to so many other things. Weighing all this up must have been extremely difficult. And in some ways, it's rather laudable, the BBC bosses, if you like, to keep and in a way protect the news organisation from knowing about this so they couldn't be compromised.
Right, well, that's interesting. So you feel they did that because they didn't want them to be compromised. I hadn't thought of that. I guess that's a possibility. But we can assume the Director General knew, and we can assume that HR knew, but no way was the head of news given a phone call or emailed in confidence.
Well, we don't know that. We don't know that. I mean, it may be possible that the director of news, because she sits at the very top of the BBC, did know, but we assume that therefore that no one else, that wasn't communicated downwards. I mean, the other thing, by the way, for keeping it quiet, is that if it had got out, if anybody in the BBC News had found out about it, it would have been. It will be on the street very quickly. So if you do want to keep it quiet, you don't tell any journalist on the whole, do you, anyway? But I think the problem there is that the public will say, well, we really need to know more. If it is true, as is now reported, for example, that when Huw Edwards was arrested, somebody senior in the BBC was told that it involved child abuse. Would that have affected the decision? You still have to work on the principle of innocent to provide guilty. The man was suspended. Do you stop paying him at that point when he hasn't been charged formally and let alone convicted? It's very, very difficult. And the best thing for the BBC to do now is just lay it all out, what they knew when, why they did what they did, and then people can make a judgment about whether they think it was adequately dealt with. It's a nightmare situation, and I feel actually sorry for the Director General having to but it keeps happening. BBC directors general keep getting these bolts from the blue, don't they? And some of them have to resign.
Yeah, but I mean, can we just be honest about this, Roger? Was it a bolt from the blue? I mean, I didn't work directly with Huw Edwards ever. I've met him on two occasions, I think, in total transparency. On both occasions, his behaviour was pretty odd. Was I the only person to have felt that maybe this was a man who wasn't quite what he seemed?
Well, lots of us are not what we see, I'm sure, but there's a vast difference between feeling somebody's a bit odd, and you could say anybody who puts themselves up to be a public figure and whatever is a bit odd. It's one thing to say somebody's a bit odd. It's another to say they're involved in making child pornography.
Of course.
I mean, that's not scale. I mean, if you were to say are only reasonable and modest people to become presenters who care about their other people, I mean, look. Lots of presenters, and I'm sure not you, have very strong elbows, very powerful egos, and perhaps at a certain point think they are different from the rest of us and therefore can act differently. But that's a miles away from actually getting involved in child pornography.
Of course, look, Roger, of course it is. And look, I would be the first to admit, and Fee will back me up, that I'm as thin-skinned and ragingly egomaniacal as the average broadcaster.
Backing you up.
Yeah, she 100% endorses that view, Roger. So that's
I had a lot in common with you, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. But I wonder whether, on a much more serious note, people who pay the licence fee because they have to are beginning to ask, does the BBC have a problem frankly, with paedophilia?
Well, the BBC clearly doesn't have a problem with paedophilia.
Well, it does. I mean, as you said earlier, this keeps happening. This is not the first time.
Well, yeah, but over 20 or 30 years, if you're now referring back to Rolf Harris and
Jimmy Savile and Jonathan King and allegations against other people.
Yeah, but you're talking about 30 to 40 years. You're talking about an organisation which for a large part of that period was the absolutely dominant broadcaster. There's over 20,000 employees. And a lot of by the way, these presenters also work for other people. I mean, it's too easy. There are a lot of people out there, commercial organisations, delighted the BBC's in trouble. There are a lot of people now, however, having the option of watching and listening to a whole range of things that don't involve paying the licence fee, not least your excellent channel, who are beginning to question the licence fee. We see that. So it's more and more difficult for the BBC to justify. I think it can, but it's more and more difficult to justify its position. They need this like a hole in the head. So what they have to do is get all the information out. Now, the worst thing, as you well know, is if they drip, drip, drip. This story is terribly important. Get the information out. Say this is the way in which we made our judgments, and then people can take a view about that. Don't hold anything back, though. But look, there are I have some sympathy for presenters because, for example, getting cross, whatever. If you're about to present, an all-night show, election or whatever, you're going to get a bit tetchy. I think you've got to allow the presenters to be a bit touchy. They're also very sensitive. They know, people are going to make an immediate judgment about them. They're visible. Everything they do is visible. You give them a little bit of space, but there's vast difference between a tetchy, egotistical presenter and a criminal who gets involved in child pornography, which sadly, desperately sadly, this is what is the case with Huw Edwards.
Appreciate your time. Thank you very much, Roger. That's Roger Bolton. And if you are interested in, BBC events, affairs, things that go on there, then I do urge you to have a listen to his podcast, Beeb Watch.
You do wonder why the BBC couldn't at least have said, until all of this murky business is cleared up, we would withhold your pay. And, if there is a satisfactory conclusion, then yes,
then
you
you're
can
back
have
on
the
board.
licence fee payers money. There was a pay rise last year for Huw Edwards as well. And also, I think that point about duty of care to employees is such an important one, but that's all employees. So there are
that's
many,
very
many
true.
people at the BBC who have been left feeling so let down and angered because they have felt that they haven't been included in a bigger picture, which has allowed them to carry on defending Huw or not piling on Huw Edwards.
I think some people felt obliged to defend him, didn't they?
And I think that's a difficult one as well.
By the way, we
So-
do talk more about this, don't we? In our
we do
off-air
in our
podcast today.
podcast. We had quite a few emails because we'd done an interview with Huw Edwards a while back. So we have answered all of your queries there.